The 3DO interactive multiplayer is a console with an undeservedly bad reputation. Sure, some parts are totally on it, just as the $700 launch price tag, but other parts, it's not completely its fault. The 3DO's low royalty rates were exploited by some rather shady companies, including one that made us bear witness to the absolute dumpster fire known as Plumbers Don't Wear Ties. May we never forget that we actually let this game be ported to modern consoles. The other big problem is a retrospective one. Many of its best games are on other systems, especially the PlayStation, and if it was lucky, the PC or Sega Saturn. While this game does have this issue, it's not to the same extent as some others like Road Rash or Gex. It's a game rarely mentioned for the system, and even more so in the genre it's part of. Those that do know of it often put it among the top games of the system, but the circumstances of its release allow some people to give it a certain moniker: the Holy Grail of the 3DO. That game is Lucienne's Quest. But does it truly live up to its reputation as among the best games of the system? Well, that's what you're about to find out. But before I start talking about the game, if you think this video ended up turning out to be worth your time, please consider subscribing and sharing this video to those who you think might be interested. Any support is very much appreciated, and I give my thanks in advance if you do so. This is Lucienne's Quest, known in Japan as Sword Sorcery. First released on the 14th of September 1995 in Japan, it somehow managed to cross the Pacific to get a North American release on the 15th of April 1996. The game's core distinction is that, on a system that was parched on RPGs to begin with, it was the only Eastern RPG to get outside Japan. All the other RPGs released in North America are classified as Western ones. This includes Guardian War, despite it being developed by a Japanese company, which even today is highly unusual. The game was developed by Microcabin, who has more of a pedigree as a publisher, but does do occasional game development of their own. Outside Japan, they're probably best known for Mystaria, or Blazing Heroes on the Sega Saturn. Compared to other RPGs of the time, this game's story is quite simple. A man named Ago is cursed as a lycanthrope and has reached the tower where the great sorcerer Kokindo resides. Upon getting in, he finds Kokindo is out doing something and the tower is in control of his apprentice Lucienne. After explaining the situation and finding out where to go next, Lucienne joins Ago on his quest to find a cure. The game's tone is set right from the opening cutscenes, and I'm just gonna say, boy is it a trip. Before I dive into that madness though, let's take a moment to look at how the rest of the game presents itself. First, the graphics. For a game that was developed in early to mid 1995, they're actually pretty decent. The 2D sprites for the characters and enemies are pretty fair, but what really stands out are the 3D backgrounds, which are very vibrant despite the system's limitations. The game's music selection is also pretty good. In fact, one of its tracks is one of my personal favorite town themes of any RPG. But what really shines as far as I'm concerned is how the entire battle system works. First, how random encounters work is twofold. On the world map, they function pretty much the way you expect them to. In the dungeons, different story. While the enemy roster is still random, the locations and where they spawn are fixed. Put simply, the field has to be big enough for you and the enemy to move around in. Once you get a grip on that, it's pretty easy to find the encounter zones. In battles, the first thing you do is move your character across the first two rows of the battlefield. Place a character in front of another one, they will be the character that takes most hits. The key to success in these battles is to use the field's terrain to your advantage. This means placing characters at just the right spots to get a clear line of fire against your enemies. Your battle party has a max of 4 characters, while the enemy party has a max of 5. Most of the game's weapon types also behave differently from one another, so apart from equipment limitations, there's quite a few ways you can handle your opponents physically. Magic in the game is just as peculiar. There are 2 types of spells, those that are single target and those that can sweep the field. However, you don't just pick a spell and then your target. In between those things, you have the choice of just how strong you want the spell to be. You want to drop 40 MP on a single target nuke? You can certainly do that. Because magic can be pretty broken this way, in fact you could do this from the very first battle, there are some counterbalances to make up for it. The first one is that Lucienne is the only character that has any actual magic spells whatsoever. However, everyone still has MP to use magic, so how did they do so? By collecting spirit bottles over the course of the game. So it's kinda like Final Fantasy VI, where Terra is the only one who can cast magic outright while everyone else requires the help of an Esper. There's also magic weapons, but those don't start appearing until the second half of the game. Speaking of Lucienne, the second counterbalance. She does not gain her spells by means of leveling up, but by fighting a villager hiding within town. To get their spells, you need to take out the next dungeon's boss, then return to town to find the villager to get them. Considering that you're able to cast a 300 damage nuke from the very first battle, I think these counterbalances are justified. Overall, I find the game's battle system to be rather unique, with its turn-based system having tactical mechanics. Alright, back to the rest of the game. As I said, the game starts with Lucienne and Ago trying to find a solution to the latter's curse. The game's tone is set right from the opening cutscene in that this is going to be a pretty lighthearted adventure. Let me tell you, this game's translation is cheesier than the entire Wisconsin dairy industry. Like, just take a look at this fine specimen of peak dialogue shown here from very early in the game, and it kinda stays this way for much of the game's first arc. After that, it becomes less of a humorous adventure and more of a total cringe fest, assuming you haven't thought the translation was such already. This especially regards Lucienne. The original Japanese version had her portrayed as this rather arrogant magician. The North American version changes it to something more like, to kind of quote Next Generation magazine here, a hyperactive 10-year-old. She's 15 in this game. At the start of the second act, it's further compounded by Lucienne turning into a near-total dunce, and Ago has to take control of the plot for most of the rest of the game. That being said, it's safe to say that this game's translation and tone is pretty whack. The game's overall difficulty can be described pretty simply. Fairly elaborate dungeons, brutal boss fights. Much like Vi for the Sega CD, almost every single boss in this game is capable of blowing your ass out of the water. I'm talking one-hit KO levels of power against the entire party. These guys is where your knowledge of terrain is really put to the test, but even then it still takes one specific move at the wrong time and it leads to a near total loss. You can try to mitigate this by trying to get as much medicine as you possibly can. How do you get medicine for the most part? By destroying everything you see like a crazy person. Yeah, if you're facing something and have a weapon with a high enough destruction stat, if you press the C button you will destroy it. This could be anything from simple crates and tables to the thickest of stone pillars. After you blow up enough shit, a random medicine will drop which will increase one of your stats. There's also an area about 3/4 of the way through the game where the difficulty goes through the roof. The biggest reason is that even the normal encounters have some nasty gimmicks of their own. This game's also really short by RPG standards of the time. I've heard people playing this game normally and still managing to complete it in less than 10 hours. Hell, I went for the effectively 100% complete route and that took me about 13 and a half. Now that I think about it, despite taking my time playing this game over late July to September 2024, the game really breezed by me. But then again, I don't really know of any particularly long 3DO games outside of Star Control 2. Out of all the RPGs I completed, this was definitely one of the quicker ones. I would say top 20 in terms of shortness. Overall, Lucienne's Quest does have some interesting quirks, but the game at large was seen as mediocre by the magazines that bothered to cover it. It didn't really matter much anyway. By the end of September, the 3DO would get its final official game, and by that point the system was out of commission anyway. Lucienne's Quest was simply left to fade to obscurity. This is where Lucienne's Quest's reputation slowly begins to take shape. When the dust finally settled, the general consensus of the 3DO was that, despite its technical ambitions and the fact that it was the best-selling new system between 1993 and 95, it was ultimately a commercial failure with not much to offer in terms of games. But for those brave enough to take the 3DO on, Lucienne's Quest could be seen as an oasis within a barren wasteland. On a system that was very much parched on RPGs to begin with, combined with the fact that the game had maybe 5 or 6 months available on the market, it wasn't a matter of if, but when Lucienne's Quest was going to become one of the most prized possessions of the 3DO. The trajectory of this game is very similar to the one game I consider my personal favorite, that being the Sega Saturn's Panzer Dragoon Saga. Okay, just hear me out here. Both games, at least their North American versions, released on the final months of their respective systems. Both games had a limited run on the market as a consequence of this. They are both considered among the very best games of their respective systems. As a result, at least as of making this video, commanding a 4-figure price tag when either go up for sale is very much the norm. The similarities kind of end there though, as Lucienne's Quest gets a bit of an advantage over Panzer Dragoon Saga. Namely, the 3DO is much less known than the Sega Saturn these days, and while Panzer Dragoon Saga is a famous game in its own right, Lucienne's Quest rarely gets mentioned. How rarely? Well, let's put it like this. Whenever you click on Browse Game on one of these types of videos, you'll be taken to that specific game's topic page. Within it is a Let's Play tab where you can find a crapload of playlists featuring YouTubers who played that specific game on their own channel. My recorded run of Lucienne's Quest and the playlist that compiles all the episodes together is one of only 4 known Let's Plays on it. 4. I find that to be absolutely nuts, to be honest. The other thing is how this game was released. Whenever a copy shows up online, it is almost always just the disc, jewel case, and manual, assuming it wasn't just disc only to begin with. Very rarely does its long box, which is standard for all 3DO releases, ever show up. That long box always puts the game over the $1,000 mark, and there's going to be a lot of hunters whenever it shows up. In other words, those bold enough to go the physical route have to go the extra step in order to get the whole thing. Adding on to that pile is one of the most inexplicable things I have ever seen in terms of gaming. The North American version of Lucienne's Quest, despite releasing so late, somehow managed to get a not-for-resale variant. This variant is a genuine rarity. A copy did show up and got sold in late April 2024, but that was the first time that variant even so much as appeared online in a very long time. If you're bold enough to go after a real copy of the North American 3DO version, by all means, hunt it as you please. But for those that don't want to pay the batshit insane numbers just to play the 3DO version, but still want to get it physically, there is a much cheaper, more accessible option. That, of course, is the Japanese Sega Saturn version. Speaking of that, let's take a quick look at the Sega Saturn version, which released at the end of May 1996 and has quite a few differences from the 3DO version that can be spotted right out of the gate. The first thing is that after the 3D intro, the character introductions are fully animated, and it looks pretty damn awesome. The character portraits and sprites have all been updated, they look fantastic as expected from a 2D powerhouse, and there's even voice acting in the storyline dialogue.
そうだ、いいこと思いついた。私が水槽玉で占ってあげるよ。
君が？まあ、コッキンドール孫子の弟子なら信用してもいいか。
Overall, the updated presentation is quite good. The only real downside is the 3D aspect of things. The Saturn version's 3D world seems pretty watered down compared to the vibrancy of the 3DO one. Don't get me wrong, it still looks fair, but I can probably attribute this a little bit to how the Sega Saturn runs 3D in general. The system's polygon generator runs on squares rather than triangles, which was one of the core reasons why porting 3D games onto the Saturn was a pain in the ass most times. But hey, even with that issue, at least it looks better than a Cybertruck. Over the past couple years, emulation on the Sega Saturn has improved so much that fan translations are becoming much more frequent. Sword Sorcery, of course, does not have one, and I don't think it's going to be anytime soon, if at all, that it gets one. Interests are more towards the highly desired stuff like Princess Crown. Hell, as I was in the process of developing this video, Psychic Assassin Taramaru got one. The difference is that Sword Sorcery did get an English release, albeit on a more obscure system. Then again, Grandia and Vandal Hearts both got translations, and as far as I'm concerned, it's only a matter of time before the first Suikoden gets one as well, despite all three of these games having some rather competent North American releases on the PlayStation. That being said, that bridge will be crossed when people get there when it comes to translating Sword Sorcery on the Saturn. Despite the lack of a translation, this is still the more accessible one physically on account of the Saturn being a much better selling system and the fact the game is dirt cheap. No, seriously, less than 20 bucks for this game is very much doable as of recording this video. And with that, that's pretty much all the differences between the Saturn and 3DO versions, and all I have to talk about in terms of Lucienne's Quest as a whole. So, is Lucienne's Quest deserving of its reputation, and is it worth the hassle to play today? I have to look at this from two different points of view. By the standards of the genre, the biggest problem with Lucienne's Quest was that it released smack dab in the middle of what could be considered the golden age of RPGs. Like, just in 1994 and 95 alone, we got the likes of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest VI, alongside Chrono Trigger, Terranigma, Breath of Fire 2, and Earthbound, all of which on Super Nintendo, Phantasy Star 4 and Shining Force 2 on the Sega Genesis, Shining Force CD, Popful Mail, and Lunar Eternal Blue on the Sega CD, and even in Japan at the time, you had the likes of Shining Wisdom and Magic Knight Rayearth on the Saturn, as well as the first two Kingsfields and Suikoden on the PlayStation. And that's just scratching the surface on the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, there were a few Dungeons & Dragons games, two of which also got on the 3DO, Dragonstone for the Amiga, Ultima 8, and the first Elder Scrolls, just to name a few. So yeah, it was very much overshadowed by quite a number of giants at the time. By the standards of the 3DO, yes, I do believe it's one of the better games on the system, and it's a great shame that it doesn't get as much attention despite being a potential system highlight. Now sure, there are better games on the 3DO in general, like its port of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Star Control 2, but when the options are slim for a specific genre on any given system, it ultimately results in mediocrity being put up on a pedestal. It's like a sports team finishing with a 500 record or worse and still making the playoffs because their division just so happened to be a flaming wreck. And that's what Lucienne's Quest kinda is. A mediocre game by RPG standards, but a highlight on the 3DO. If you're looking to check into the 3DO for any reason whatsoever, Lucienne's Quest is a game worth checking out. But if you want to get your hands on a physical copy without spending the eye-gouging numbers for a North American 3DO copy, the Japanese Saturn version, though untranslated, will serve you well. Hey everybody, Eclipse14 here, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this little video about a game I actually like that was celebrating its 30th anniversary. If you're interested in checking out my run through the game, here's a link to my Let's Play playlist. Beyond that, if you liked what you saw, drop a like, and if you think my work was worth your time, please subscribe and share this video to those who you think might be interested. I think that's all I've got to say, so thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.